Hi guys, welcome. Hope everyone is good today. Currently the UK is on lockdown, so browsing for materials in person is pretty limited. But as they say, with every dark cloud comes a silver lining. So I thought I'd make the most of it and build some terrain. Whilst pretty much being housebound, I quickly became aware of how much additional waste and recycling I was producing. So what better way than to use some of it than in a build. I began with these pill containers that were in my box of useful bits and thought they would make for some nice supports. Next I took a lid from a box of chocolates left over from Christmas and a piece of EVA foam which I cut to size. And it was this chocolate box that inspired the build. The octagonal shape and overall proportion screamed landing pad to me. So I began arranging my parts to get a sense of how they could fit together. I trimmed the lids from the tubes off carefully using a sharp blade and always paying attention to where the blade will go. It's so easy to have a momentary lapse of concentration and cut yourself. Next, I cut some 20mm XPS foam to use as a support and flesh out the base. Whenever I build something, I try to make it in a way that is somewhat believable, or at least makes sense in my head. I glue all this together with some hot glue. And I'm using hot glue here because with all different materials in play, it seems to work best across the board. In some instances, where you are working with a smooth, rigid plastic, the hot glue won't adhere to the surface, so you could try a couple of dots of super glue to reinforce the contact points. And then shave off the corners for a little extra visual appeal. This isn't the easiest thing to do neatly, but as you can see, some cuts were cleaner than others, but not to worry. I won't lose sleep over it. It creates a bit of added texture. Then I glue all this together, taking care to line everything up so it's central. Next I will borrow an idea I first came across on Wylock's Armory's channel, who I'm sure you all know by now, and if not, then he's definitely one to add to your list. I used 2mm graphics pads and cut strips to various sizes. I always have a bunch of these strips to hand, as they are fantastic for cladding or hiding joints. I glued this to the edge of the chocolate box to change the shape a little, and take it away from being a chocolate box lid. Some of the joints were not perfect, but you can always sand these down a little with a sanding block. With another strip, I drew up some stairs and carefully cut these out. These will act as supports for the steps to sit on. I then cut out a whole bunch of steps from more strips. I began with one extra strip on each side, which will help keep everything tidy and also adds a little rigidity. I then cut some diamond sheet foot treads to size and glued these onto each step, making any adjustments as necessary. I glued these together and then spread an even layer of glue and then added some rigid plastic for a bit of texture. This is often referred to as granny grating, but it is actually canvas mesh for embroidery. I then used some more strips to cover the edges of the platform and hide the foam board, and added some more diamond plate sheeting to the platform. I then cut several small pieces to make a small step, which I can easily add to the landing pad to lessen the changes in height. I then used these funny little dome nuts as lights and glued these into the 8 corners of the landing pad. These are great and can be easily found at most hardware stores. I mounted the platform on a vitamin tube cut to height to match the height of the stairs. I then glued the stairs on carefully. And using the grid pattern on the canvas mesh to guide me to where the 2 sets of stairs will go so that everything lines up nicely. And sometimes things will go wrong, sometimes excitement gets the better of us and we make mistakes. But it's all part of the learning curve. It's how we improve, and I firmly believe that if you have the imagination and creativity to attempt something like this, then you also have the capacity to solve all the small problems that come along when building. But that constant back and forth between problem and solution is why we love this hobby so much, right? Next I took some bamboo skewers and glued these to the edge of the stairs. This adds a nice little decorative detail which when painted will look great. I made a little computer terminal out of an internal bulkhead of a rhino, which I clipped down and then glued this to the back of some graphics pad. I then added some small little styrene rods to act as a base and then glued this onto the platform. This layering of materials and textures helps move each individual component away from its recognizable form and into the illusion we're trying to create, if that makes sense to you. The next question was how to join these components together, and in this case I opted for magnets. This would allow me to make storage and transport easier whilst not moving around all the time when in use. This could also be added to if I go on to make a modular walkway system. Either way, lots of options. I glued these to the inside and they are plenty strong to still attract the other magnet through the plastic. I then mounted the magnets to the platform in their corresponding position. After a quick undercoat and some grey primer, everything is starting to take shape and is looking really good. I cut out an imperial aquila from some card, and this may seem more complicated than it actually is. I printed it out at the size I wanted and then cut it into smaller manageable shapes with a pair of scissors, and then cut in the finer details with a scalpel. Take your time and be a little patient and everything will work out great. Next I added a little card border to the platform to clean up some of the joints, and then I mixed some black and silver to create a sort of gunmetal colour. I also used some grey, in this case German uniform from Vallejo, and painted up the stairs, trim and computer terminal. And again, always keeping my paint thin so I don't end up with thick globs of paint which would obscure the texture underneath. If you need a second coat to get that solid colour, then so be it, but it doesn't take much more time and it will give you a much better finish to your paint jobs. And this border trim that I added just softens the transition between materials and helps neaten everything up a little. Spending a little time on things can always really pay off in the end. I then pick out the bamboo trim along the stairs and edge of the platform in white. Next I added another little detail under the aquila because, in all truth, I stuck the aquila down in the wrong place and it was annoying me. So I invented something else to add and rebalanced the composition. I then painted the sides red and notice that I've switched brushes here. I know it may seem obvious to some of you, but always use the brush that is appropriate to your task at hand. There are so many different styles of brushes out there, each with their own benefits and drawbacks. Here I'm using a cheap, flat tip type brush because I can be pretty rough with it and still achieve good coverage and brush control. But there is no correct brush or style, so experiment and always go with what works best for you. And then used a sponge to break up the flat texture of the landing pad. Mixing between darker and lighter greys, I was able to add some colour variation and break up the monotony of a single colour to create the illusion of texture. And again, there's no correct way of doing this, just keep moving the paint around until everything starts to blend together. Try to avoid repeating patterns when you do this. And you can do this by changing the angle and pressure with which you dab the sponge on the surface. I paint in the supports in a warm grey and pick out the aquila and plaque in a dirty white applied unevenly to enforce a sense of texture and degradation. On a side note, whilst I try to explain everything clearly, there are always some questions that come up, so please, if you have any questions about any of the materials or techniques that I use, feel free to get involved in the comments below. I've been amazed by the support of everyone so far and really want to grow a community of like-minded people so that our combined knowledge pool gets even bigger for us all. A safe place to come together and chill and just make things. If you go over the edges a little, as I did, these are easily corrected with some of your previous colour. I then break out the airbrush and start to spray the bamboo to give the white some brightness and allow for some overspray in the surrounding areas. It is important not to go overboard with this, but go with what feels right and err on the side of caution. With the same white in my airbrush, I draw soft lines coming from the dome nuts into the centre. I try to have a slightly crisper line towards the light and imply that the light will diffuse as it gets further away. And always try to avoid putting your fingertip in wet paint, as I just did, as this will leave fingerprints. Next is a snazzy little trick from the world of automotive painting, and that is to use candy paints to filter the colours underneath. These are very transparent paints which really allow you to build up an opacity of colour in a very gradual way. Giving an added depth, these can look fantastic if executed well. But in this case, I'm using it purely as a filter to tint the beams of light and neon on the stairs. And if you're new to the world of airbrushing, it can be a fantastic tool for certain situations. It can be a little complicated to begin with, and there are many small mechanical parts which can easily break. Different paint behaves differently when sprayed. In short, there's many variables. And it's not the cheapest hobby to get into, but if you try it and you like it, or you are interested in giving it a go, I couldn't recommend it highly enough. Once you get your head around the strange finger gymnastics involved, the airbrush almost becomes an extension of your own hand, and it becomes a very natural thing to use. But as with learning anything new, you'll have to overcome your initial frustration before you reap the rewards. So stick with it. On reflection, I felt everything was looking a little too clean, so I added a simple wash, mixed up with some black and brown and a little water and some acrylic medium to add some grime and general grunge. Now you could argue that I should have done this step before airbrushing the lights, and you would be correct. But remember what I said about getting excited and making mistakes? Well, here is a perfect example. I wanted to see what the lights would look like and completely forgot to apply the wash stage. So sometimes we have to take one step back to take two steps forward, but not to worry, it's all easily fixed. And when applying this wash in a similar fashion to the grey of the landing pad, it's important to try avoid creating obvious patterns and keep things random. Our brains are designed to recognise visual patterns and apply logic or rationale to these in an attempt to process our surroundings. Now, most of this happens on a subconscious level, and yet if one is aware of this fact, then we can take advantage of this natural instinctive process to either remove a visual pattern or expectation, or to add one. Think of a magician and how they trick the eye into believing what they want it to. The same logic can be applied to patterns we leave in paint. To bring the detail back up, I added some silver lightly dry brushed all over the metal surfaces. And then give the beams of light another pass with a white and candy blue to get that luminosity that I lost behind the wash coat. And the last thing left to do is paint this computer terminal. I began with some lime green in the bottom left corners of each screen, and whilst this was still wet, I hit the top right with some black. I cleaned my brush and then began to mix the two wet colours together directly into each other. This is a process of pushing paint backwards and forwards until you start to see the colours blend. At first this will look terrible, but don't worry, with a few passes back and forth, things will start to take shape. I pick some colours and pick out the buttons on the terminal again, opting for some variation to add some visual interest. And begin to define the blends on the monitors with a little more colour. Then switching to a brighter yellow green, I add in some details on the screen. And if you've made it this far into the video and like what you've seen so far, then show your appreciation by hitting that like button. Subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and share it with a friend who you think might find it interesting. Now, this build was relatively quick and pretty simple in its construction, and yet I think it looks great, and I'm pretty happy with how things eventually turned out. This will be a nice addition to any battlefield and is modular, so I can always add to it in the future. Is it perfect? No. Would I change things if I were to build it again? Of course. But most of all, was it fun? Definitely.
Barrett 44, Quebec. Student departure is approved and on this frequency. Take off. For 3 on the runway, at your convenience.